Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation is driven by one goal: housing affordability for all. They're about solving housing affordability together. CMHC offers supply-oriented programs, funding programs, market intelligence, research, data, and a team dedicated to push the boundaries of housing innovation. Visit cmhc.ca to learn more about how you can play a role in their ambitious goal that by 2030, everyone in Canada has a home that they can afford and meets their needs. CMHC helps make housing affordable in many ways. Learn more about Canada's National Housing Strategy, funding, research, and so much more at cmhc.ca.
We at On the Way Home would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And in Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Welcome to On the Way Home, a podcast dedicated to the issues surrounding homelessness and the incredible experts making a difference in the lives of homeless people. Remember to subscribe to the podcast anywhere you're listening and share it with a friend.
Hello and welcome to On the Way Home. This is a show that talks about all things housing and homelessness, and we are so fortunate from week to week to have amazing guests come on and share their insight and experience, and this week will be no different. It's brought to you by the partners Blue Door, which is my organization in York Region, and the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, which is a national organization. Right now at Blue Door, we want to say a huge thanks to everyone for coldest night of the year. We had that recently. We were able to raise $160,000, and we can't do that without the support of the community. So we are truly grateful for everyone who stepped up. And for those of you who stepped up across the country as supporting so many, I believe it was $11 million raised through coldest night of the year across Canada. So thank you very much. Right now, with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, they are working hard on their Vote Housing campaign. So check out their website. Go to caeh.ca and see how you could get involved and push others to get involved too. It's only together that we can make housing count in the next vote moving forward. Well, let's get on to today's guests. We have three guests today, the power of three. Two you may be very familiar with as they've been on the show before, and our third I'm very excited about. Today we have Clovis, Dr. Alex, and Jesse with us. So really, really excited to have them on. Clovis Grant, as you may know, is the CEO for 360 Kids, which provides a range of supports and services for youth ages 16 to 26 in York Region who are homeless or at risk of experiencing homelessness. Clovis believes that addressing intersectionalities is an important part of our commitment to delivering effective services to our community. Well said, Clovis. We also have Dr. Alex, who is a scientist at the Institute for Mental Health Policy Research at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and an assistant professor at the Dalalana School of Public Health, Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Now I'll say this, but it's not in his bio, but the best and brightest research that has been done around 2SLGBTQ plus youth across this country, maybe around the world, has been done by Dr. Alex. That's my own plug for him. That's not in his bio, but I just wanted to add that. Dr. Alex has been addressing the issue of 2SLGBTQ plus youth homelessness for nearly 15 years and is award-winning, internationally recognized leader in the area of 2SLGBTQ plus health and homelessness. Over the years, he's advocated continuously for policy and practice changes to improve the lives of 2SLGBTQ plus youth. He has worked closely with all levels of government to develop policies and strategies that address the needs of 2SLGBTQ plus youth individuals, and is committed to research that successfully and ethically engages the community and situates 2SLGBTQ plus youth, young people experiencing homelessness as knowledge makers. And last but certainly not least, we have the awesome Jesse with us, who is a professional musician, a peer mentor to many youth in the community, and a peer outreach worker with lived experience, a lived expert in areas such as addiction and homelessness at 360 Kids. They were awarded youth recognition in the framework of Public Heroes Program. Most importantly, Jesse is a young individual dedicated to making a change in their community. So Clovis, Alex, Jesse, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
We have a standard question here at On the Way Home that we ask everyone because it's a little different to everyone. And we'll go in the order. We'll go Jesse, Clovis, Alex, starting with Jesse. Jesse, what does home mean to you?
And that's a very good question, because that's something that I ask myself a lot in terms of my lived experience on the streets, right? And it's always, how do you know your home when you don't actually have a home, And I always used to tell myself, home is where the heart is if you can bring home with you, then you'll always be home everywhere you are.
Beautifully said.
Oh, was I next? Sorry.
Go for it, Clovis.
All right. I'll answer it by saying last week we did an overnight experience, not unlike the what you just talked about, Mike.
Coldest night of the year.
Coldest night of the year. Sorry, my brain just froze. And I came home and I was. It was just a wonderful experience to feel the warmth when I opened my door, and so I couldn't help but think about what it's like to have a home, and the protection, the warmth, that no vulnerability. That's when I think about home. That comes to mind.
Yeah, protection. That's great, fantastic. Alex?
Yeah, I would say, similar to Jesse, this is something I have thought about a lot over the years, especially given, the work that I do, working with young people. And the first thing that comes to mind is, I think, pretty obvious that home is definitely much more than a physical space. You can live in a house, but it might not be a home. And I think that's really, really important to me. And, I would say on a personal level, to me, home is something that signifies safety and belonging. Home is a place where you can be exactly who you are and you don't have to fear for your safety.
Well said. Three great answers. Alex, we know that COVID-19 has been hard on all of us. Everyone. It talks about how hard it's been, but even more so for 2SLGBTQ plus youth who are experiencing homelessness. You've recently conducted research that speaks to this. Can you provide a background as to how this research came about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, before the pandemic started, we already knew that 2S LGBTQ youth were, experiencing homelessness, faced numerous challenges with regards to accessing safe and affirming housing, and as well as higher rates of mental health issues compared to heterosexual and cisgender youth. So this is something we already knew before COVID. And then COVID hit. So, once the pandemic started, it was a very sort of obvious next step for my team and I. And it would be, at that point, it was like, very important for us to understand how is the pandemic impacting queer and trans youth who are experiencing homelessness, especially given that so many support services had to shut their doors, weren't able to provide the same services as they once did when the pandemic started. So, couldn't help but wonder, like, okay, so what's going to happen now? Where are these young people going to go? Are they going to be forced back into the houses that they once lived in where they were forced to leave? And that is sort of how the study came to be. And I'll just give you a little bit of sort of, background information about the actual study. And so this is an ongoing study that I've been leading that focuses on understanding the impacts of the pandemic on 2S LGBTQ youth who are at risk of homelessness, but also who are experiencing homelessness in the greater Toronto area and in surrounding areas as well. And so for this study, we recruited about 92 young people in the GTA and surrounding areas, and they completed virtual surveys, 3 surveys, so it was about every 3 months. And then there were approximately 33 youth from those 92 that participated in in-depth one-on-one interviews where we were able to really sort of get at, there's like the survey and just understanding the numbers and these standardized measures. But then the interviews, that's about understanding people's actual lived realities and what's behind those numbers. And that's really what we did with those interviews. And then we also interviewed about 15 key informants, so individuals who work at support services, who manage these different programs. And just sort of high level, we found that, no surprise, that the pandemic really impacted 2SLGBTQ youth in a number of significant ways. And so there were, many different ways that the pandemic impacted these young people. But among, the most significant, we found that housing was a really big one. So the pandemic impacted access to housing, access to safe housing in many cases. And so, for example, we asked youth, where were you living prior to the pandemic? And then where are you living now? And we asked that question every 3 months. And we found that 12% of youth were living in a public space prior to the pandemic. And then once the pandemic hit, 32% were living in a public space. So I think that really goes to show that there was a really big jump in terms of, young people living in public spaces, in their car, in a car, in a park, outside public space. And we also found that there was an increase in youth living in supportive programs as well, and transitional housing programs. We also found that there were higher rates of violence that youth were experiencing, and identity-based violence and identity-based abuse in many cases. So there were youth who were, as I mentioned before, had nowhere to go, and so they were forced back into abusive households in some cases. Maybe they were couch surfing before the pandemic, and then pandemic hit, and the main message was stay home, don't leave your house, and so they were forced back into these abusive homes. And so a lot of youth really described feeling very trapped in these types of situations where there was no support available to them. Yeah, and I would say, consistent with our previous research that I've conducted in this area, we found that mental health was really sort of a major finding. And mental health, actually, it's no surprise. Mental health is always, I would say, a major finding in a lot of these studies that I lead. And, with like higher rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, suicide attempts, unfortunately. And so, no surprise there once the pandemic hit and there wasn't any support available to many of these youth in many cases, then of course, people are going to suffer in terms of their mental health. And then lastly, I'm just going to touch on another major finding that an area that we explored was COVID vaccine attitudes and COVID vaccine uptake. And so we asked, a number of questions about whether you would get the vaccine, have you gotten the vaccine, just people's thoughts around that. And I would say that most participants either had received a COVID vaccine or they were planning to receive a vaccine. But more than 1/3 of youth expressed that they were unsure, or they were actually not planning to receive a vaccine. And we found that the lack of confidence around vaccine uptake was even higher among Indigenous and racialized participants, those who identified as Indigenous, Asian, Black, or Latinx. They were almost 5 times as likely to be hesitant about getting a COVID vaccine. And the reason for this is also really no surprise in terms of mistrust in the healthcare system, and mistrust because of previous traumatic experiences that people have had engaging with healthcare providers. And unfortunately, that often happens to racialized youth, not just youth, but individuals. In this case, obviously, we're talking to young people. A lot of the youth also expressed that there were barriers in terms of accessing a vaccine. And then, of course, ongoing, mental health issues were also a common sort of reason why youth decided to not get vaccinated.
Wow. This is amazing stuff. Very, very impactful. And I knew you were going to mention trust there and experience in the system. It's sad to see, but it is a true reality. Clovis, you are the largest provider of services for youth experiencing homelessness in New York region. What were you and your team seeing during the pandemic in regards to its effects on 2SLGBTQ plus youth?
Thanks for the question, and thanks, Alex, for sharing your thoughts because certainly as a provider supporting many young people every year, we saw a lot of that. I would say a few descriptors: isolation, anxiety, confusion, fear. All of that were just common refrains throughout the pandemic for many young people. The impact of just the unknowns of the virus was just very concerning to many young people. And when you add in the challenges that groups who are considered on the margins, such as 2S LGBTQ plus youth, racialized youth, that anxiety, that uncertainty, it just goes out the window. So the need for mental health supports was certainly very strong, and and I think one of the things that we saw was the impact of closing programs. One thing we know about young people is the need for relationships, and when you limit those relationships, it's a bad recipe, and 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 so that's one of the things that we saw, and there's some things that we did to mitigate that through some online um, um, programming, which was I saw two impacts. On the one hand, some young people wanted the in-person, and having support workers like Jesse to help with that was helpful. But we also saw that there were some youth who wanted the virtual, and in fact, some um, some groups in particular, cultural groups, Asian Asians in particular, we saw an uptake in terms of young people who were 2S LGBTQ from the Asian population actually felt more comfortable in an online space, which was great that we were able to provide that. So I would say those were some of the things that we saw. Building and creating community was such an important piece, and so whether it be the in-person or virtual, and ways that we've had to respond to our young people to these needs is through partnerships. We have quite a number of different partners that helped create some of that space. York Region Police was an important partner. Family Services York Region, Care Connections. All of these groups were of particular importance in helping us build the community for these young people, providing very specific counseling support groups, whether it be online and mostly online, but some in person, and some of that cultural connections was critical. One of the things that I also saw was very helpful as we try to build that community with the young people um, was uh, youth voice. And we have a youth strategy where we're working upstream to look at how we can work together to address some of um, the barriers that um, drive young people to homelessness, the discrimination that many encounter. How can we as a system um, intervene or disrupt some of those drivers, especially for the 2S LGBTQ plus population, and having the voice of young people around the table and actually telling us what to do and how to do it more effectively, I saw was really critical. And one of the last things I wanted to say here is creating that space, not just through the strategy, but through a paid position, such as our peer youth outreach workers, also helped young people find their voice and helping us to create new opportunities for them. And someone like Jesse and other young people who came forward and actually did outreach to the community really helped us make programming so much more relevant to their needs. And so those were some of the observations that we had, and some of the ways that we tried to intervene to disrupt and create solutions.
And thank you for that insight, Clovis. Amazing stuff. And you mentioned the superstar known as Jesse. Jesse, I have a two-part question for you. Number one, what were you surprised about in the report? Did anything surprise you in particular? And the second part of that question is, what do you think has to change in the system so that youth experiencing homelessness and 2SLGBTQ plus youth in particular are not at risk?
So I guess one of the things that surprised me about the findings was that the rate of self-harm was actually higher than the rate of problematic substance and or alcohol use, which came off as quite a surprise for me because, coming from my personal experience, one thing that we saw very commonly amongst youth experiencing homelessness or who are at risk of homelessness was substance use. It was very, very prominent. And so just to find out that and I believe the rate was about 81%. 81% of youth who were at risk or experiencing homelessness reported having self-harmed during the pandemic. And it was quite a sad surprise, because again, speaking from personal experience, it takes quite a lot of distress to engage in those kind of behaviors. Very often when we speak about self-harm, it's often a ways to cope with too many feelings, too many things that are there all at once, and so you need to find an outlet to sort of let those feelings out. And so just the fact that there were so many distressing emotions happening because of the pandemic was quite shocking, right? And I think going forward, when it comes to offering services specifically to LGBTQ youth in our community, one of the things is these services need to be non-judgmental and specifically geared towards LGBTQ youth. Because unfortunately, we don't see many of that. We don't see many services, specifically housing services, for LGBTQ youth that offer them a space where they can truly be themselves, but not only that, but actually explore their identity. It's one thing to say that you identify as being part of the LGBTQ community, but one thing about queerness is that you are constantly exploring it. It's constantly developing, and youth deserve a space to be able to explore that and explore that safely, right, with a certain guidance. And the second thing that I would say is very, very important when it comes to youth experiencing homelessness, and more so LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness, is to be able to give them the opportunity to tell us what they need. One thing that I often saw in my personal experience and in my professional experience is youth being told what they need, is the assumption of service providers knowing or assuming what they need. And the reality is they always say you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And so I feel that services would be much more efficient if we are able to actually collaborate with youth and allow them to tell us specifically what they need and actually accept that rather than sort of force our professional outlook on them.
Well said, Jesse. Nothing for us without us, I believe, is the phrase. And yeah, you're absolutely right. And listen, that speaks to another report that Dr. Alex did with, I think, Clovis and myself and others before, that showed exactly what you're talking about. We need more safe places and individual specific places for 2SLGBTQ plus youth. And out of that came a program in York Region called Inclusion that will continue to actually expand over the next few years. But we need to move forward. I have a double question for you, Dr. Alex. Can you talk to some of the recommendations coming out of this report? And if people want to see it, where do they go?
Great. Okay. So, there were a number of different recommendations that we did make, and we did share those in the form of policy briefs and some peer review publications, presentations, which are ongoing as well. And so I would say among some of the major recommendations that we have made would be, number one is really sort of the urgent need to prioritize and promote 2S LGBTQ inclusive and affirming services. And this is really an ongoing recommendation that tends to come out of all of this work, because we're just still not there yet. We still need more, inclusive, truly inclusive and safe spaces, affirming spaces. And we can, achieve that by a number of different ways, by training and educating all staff on the lived realities and needs of 2S LGBTQ youth, as well as increasing 2S LGBTQ representation among staff, right? So, young people, they want to see themselves reflected in the services that they access. I mean, we all do. We want to be able to relate, especially if we're trying to get support. I think that's just so terribly important. And I think, I would also say that youth-serving organizations really, truly need to ensure that the services that they offer are safe and inclusive to all youth, and not just some youth. We cannot keep creating and recreating these programs that are just designed for one type of person, because we're never going to end homelessness if we keep doing that. And then I would say sort of the second sort of recommendation is to really prioritize the delivery of mental health supports and mental health programs. Especially population-based mental health supports, because, as we found, with this study, was that there just wasn't enough specialized mental health support that was able to truly, meet the needs of 2S LGBTQ youth, especially transgender and non-binary youth. And then I would say that there were a number of different recommendations, but I'm going to just highlight three. And so the last one that I really want to highlight is the importance of engaging and hiring peer support workers, and as well as engaging young people, 2S LGBTQ youth, in the development of these types of services and in the development of solutions. So we have to co-create solutions working with peer workers and with 2S LGBTQ youth, just exactly as Jesse said. And so in terms of your second question was, where can folks access the report? And so we've actually developed a number. There's not just one report. There's a number of different sort of publications, and we're continuing to publish because we have collected so much data, and there's so much to share and so many recommendations. And so so these can be accessed, I would say, through EENet, EENet Connect. It's an evidence exchange network for mental health and addictions run through CAMH, and that's eenetconnect.ca. That site does share actually all of these different publications, and as well as our policy briefs. And then another way would be actually on Twitter. I share a lot. I've actually pinned a lot of these different publications, and so you can just follow me on Twitter at Alex Abramovich. Thank you.
Amazing. And I check this work out. It's powerful. It's impactful. It's helpful. We shouldn't move forward without taking a hard look at this and moving forward with the recommendations. So thank you, Dr. Alice. Clovis, where can people go to find out more about the incredible and life-changing work you and Jesse are doing at 360 Kids?
At 360kids.ca, you'll find everything that we're doing, and appreciate the opportunity to share that.
Well, thank you all for making this important work happen. Thank you all for sharing it. If we really want to do justice to this work, let's make sure we make those changes moving forward. If you can imagine, and I know all of you can, because we've talked about this, but the one place where you want to feel safe, it isn't, and during a pandemic, you are forced back into that spot. How terrifying that must be, right? And it still continues. This is great, impactful work. Thank you all for what you do and you continue to do, and thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it. Man, this is so important, and this work is so important. Yes, COVID has affected everyone, but it has affected our most vulnerable even more so. It has affected our 2S LGBTQ plus youth even more so. This report shows that. But we don't do these reports. Alex, Clovis, Jesse don't take part in this. So we take a report, put it on the shelf, and say good work. We do this work so change can happen. And it's up to us to share this work, to take heed, to read this work, and to make those changes happen, to involve youth in decisions, as Jesse said, right? It's old people like me who think they know the answer shouldn't be making those calls. We should be talking to the people that it affects and that it's for. And again, that is ever evolving, as Jesse said. Don't just think, you have one discussion and there you go, right? Because needs are ever changing. It's important stuff. It's important to have programs like Blue Doors Inclusion that comes out of this research that really makes it impossible for all of us to turn that blind eye to this, to say we need safe spaces. Let's make it happen. That wouldn't have happened without the support of everyone on this call. Another great episode of On the Way Home. Share it, subscribe, and tune in next week. See you then.